it is only fitting that we should dedicate some time at this conference to the memory of our friend Maggie Archer. As many of you know, Maggie had already graciously accepted to deliver one of the keynote addresses at this conference. Even at The Hague, she was already enthusiastic about the idea of flying over to Manila and had even committed to joining our beach outing this coming weekend. In fact, we already have her abstract and slide deck for her keynote, which she entitled Describing, Explaining, Evaluating, Interrelated but Distinct. Thanks to those of you who posted about your memories and sentiments about Maggie on our online memorial to her. Feel free to read through some of the very moving posts, and if you haven't yet, feel free to add your own this evening. All you have to do is use the QR code on the screen. We plan to share all of this with her family after the conference. This evening, IACR would like to celebrate her work and her life. We've invited some of our closest friends and colleagues to say a few words about her. If we have time, I will invite some of you to come up and add your own reflections and memories about Maggie. So we shall begin online. We shall begin with one of her closest colleagues at the Center for Social Ontology, Mark Carrigan. So let's take a listen. Is Mark online?
Hi everyone, I'm Mark Carrigan. I'm recording this reflection in case technical difficulties prevent me from joining you at the... Hi everyone, I'm Mark Carrigan. I'm recording this reflection in case technical difficulties prevent me from joining you at the session. I'm sorry I can't be there, and I'm really glad I was asked to contribute to this memorial because Maggie had a huge impact on my life. Most people I know in critical realism, I met when I was doing a postdoc with her at the Center for Social Ontology from 2014 to 2017, when it was based at the University of Warwick. But the impact she had on me was actually much earlier than that. I first met her as a philosophy student in my early 20s. I'd come to Warwick for an MA in continental philosophy, having spent 3 years getting very frustrated by a quite classical and staid degree in analytic philosophy at UCL. I hoped that continental philosophy would show me the things that I had felt were lacking and provide excitement, but in practice, I was just as frustrated as I had been as an undergraduate, despite being taught and guided in a very different style of philosophical thought. It was during this time in my first semester, in actually my first day of my first week, that I met Maggie. She ran a module between the sociology and philosophy departments, and it was my first access to social theory. It was a breath of fresh air, and I very quickly began to realize that actually I wasn't interested in philosophy, or at least my natural terrain was social theory. And I found these new ideas and styles of thought intoxicating. Ironically, it was Maggie who first introduced me to Richard Rorty. And I spent a year and a half as a committed neo-pragmatist, arguing with a great length that philosophy was ultimately a self-defeating discipline which should be dissolved into poetry. At the time, I don't think I realized quite how profoundly hostile she was to that view. And she argued back, pushing me, but she was never anything less than encouraging. And since she died, I have thought a lot about that intellectual generosity and how often it wasn't visible to people who weren't taught by her or didn't know her well. And this was one of the first encounters I had with it, to be encouraged in the exploration of ideas which she profoundly disagreed with. But there were many subsequent encounters with that intellectual generosity in the years following. The next was when I came to her having made arrangements to do a PhD in political philosophy. I did not know what I wanted to do, but I did realize that I didn't want to do that, raising the question of why I had committed to it in the first place. Possibly in retrospect, there was an element of interest here, given this was the time at which she was studying reflexivity of students. But she took the time to talk this through with me and helped me decide to do an MA in social research as a buffer year, while I decided what, if anything, I wanted to do as a doctoral project. I was still at this stage a committed Rortian, and I had what I realize now was being a profoundly irritating inclination to try and dissolve the pseudo problems of the theorists around me. And it occurred to me again, I never felt even the slightest flicker of irritation from her about this. She, I think, approached the responsibilities as a teacher with immense seriousness, and that meant challenging, pushing, but never reverting to authority to shut down a conversation or outright trying to stamp down ideas which she didn't agree with. And I found those challenges so formative, even if I didn't realize it at the time. It was during my subsequent social research MA that I guess I became a critical realist. Although in retrospect, it was clear to me that I think I'd absorbed a lot of it osmotically through these interactions with Maggie. I think at this time, she was working on the early stages of the project written up in the reflexive imperative. But I spent that year reading a range of philosophers like Frankfurt, McIntyre, and Tyler, all of which she had initially introduced me to. And I started to read critical realism for the first time. But it was when I read Making Our Way Through the World, which had been released the summer before, that I had this moment of revelation about my outlook and what I wanted to study. I still think that's her best book. It might not be the most complex book, but I think it's the best. Interestingly, when I asked her about this, she seemed quite clear that Culture and Agency was her most important work. But what struck me about that was the realization that the philosophical issues that had come to fascinate me could be articulated in a sociological register without losing their conceptual nuance or existential sensitivity. This is what I think is at the heart of the Reflexivity project, and Maggie's skills and expertise as a qualitative researcher should, I think, be seen as on an equal footing to her evident expertise as a theorist. She had a remarkable existential sensitivity, something which I think when perhaps she was being combative at times at conferences would not come through. But she was a remarkable listener and had a capacity to engage without falling into the role of the cipher. And those books were hugely important to me, and I think they're an astonishing body of work, which I hope continues to be developed. One which, as much as I'm saying this at IACR, I think it's important we recognise is a project with deep and diverse philosophical roots. People like Harry Frankfurt, Jean Piaget, Merleau-Ponty, Peirce, and Taylor all figure so prominently in those books. And there's a huge range of these intellectual sources, which I think complicate tendencies that concern me to position Maggie as a sociological elaborator of Roy Bhaskar. The problem I found, though, as a master's student whose intellectual horizon had suddenly opened out through discovering reflexivity, was that the intellectual depth of this position immediately required doing a lot of reading. I moved on to structure, agency, and the internal conversation of being human. These were over 1,000 pages between them. The reflexive imperative took the reflexivity books up to almost 1,400. And then to really understand these, you had to go back to the earlier works of realist social theory and culture and agency, both almost 400 pages. These 6 books, which Fred Vanderberg once memorably described as the Archers, I think are a substantial body of work in their length, but also in their systematicity. It was after I started my part-time PhD with Maggie that I committed to working through them systematically. And it's still to this day the most formative intellectual experience of my life, as well as being supervised by her. I've begun to go back to them now with a view to repeating the process, and I hope others might want to join me in this. Because in a real sense, these books were one single project undertaken over 25 years. They're regularly narrated as such. They were by Maggie and by people who write and reflect on her work. But the interconnection between them is something that I think is quite remarkable. I found it at the time intimidating, the clarity, the systematicity of it all. And it's only as I got to know her kind of later, as I moved into being a postdoc and then kept in touch with her as a friend and mentor in the subsequent years, that I realized how hard won that analytical clarity was. These books are so polished. I've often thought that a book like Realist Social Theory has something in common in its conceptual style with a thinker like John Rawls. It's much more substantive, it's much closer to the social world, and it's much more concerned with the practical task of social analysis. But there's a conceptual clarity, a rigor with which ideas are connected together in systematic ways that does have something of the best of analytic philosophy in it. But it's as I got to know the story behind them that I realized that there's kind of intellectual bravery underpinning that, in the sense in which each of these books was a response to the problems left behind in the previous book. In the process of developing answers to them, the project as a whole became something ever more sophisticated and interconnected. She told me when I did an interview with her years later that if you start writing a book and you don't feel as if you're drowning, it's not worth doing. I thought back to that a lot in the last few weeks because I'm trying to finish off a book and I feel I'm drowning. And that recognition that the capacity to produce important work isn't simply the natural expression of a brilliant mind, though of course her mind was brilliant. It's something she worked at with rigor and determination and bravery. And it's a given that I'm inspired by the contents of these works still, but I wanted to point to the form of them and suggest that we can take inspiration from that as well. In 2009, William Arthwaite talked about the nascent canonical status of her work in British sociology, but my concern is that this is less assured than it once did. Arthwaite wrote at the time that the theory boys tend to be boys. It's hard not to wonder how her trajectory might have been different if she had been a member of this club, because when I helped her do an analysis of engagements with her work and citations of them in the mid-2010s, it was clear there was a prominent trend even then to frame her as an elaborator of Bhaskar and critic of Giddens. Her originality as an enormously rigorous yet creatively synthetic thinker, I worry, will not show up as prominently as it should in intellectual history. And that's in spite of the countless external markers of recognition, such as the ISA Presidency and BSA Lifetime Achievement Award. There are tendencies to restrict the engagement with her work and how it's narrated, which I think are troubling. And those of us who have been friends, colleagues, collaborators, supporters, fellow travelers, ought to be firm in pushing back against these where we encounter them. Because this is a remarkable body of work, and to slip into framing it as an elaboration or a footnote would be a profound act of epistemic violence and intellectual laziness, even if she might not have accepted the gendered way in which I frame this here. I think one thing she had real contempt for was intellectual laziness above all else. She wanted people to push the work that they did on a conceptual level, at the level of ideas. And I think one of the reasons for that is that it made them more interesting for her to talk to. And there was an intellectual sociability for her, quite unlike many people I've met before. There was a real passion for ideas. And I think that shows throughout the work. I learned many things from Maggie, but first of them was to take thinking seriously, to never be content with platitudes, to hold on to ideas and see where they take us. In the 17 years I had the privilege to relate to her as an interlocutor, she was never anything other than encouraging about the direction of my own work, even if I think my interest in and preference for things that aren't theory might have been slightly disappointing to her in some ways. And it occurred to me also that people didn't see her vast intellectual hinterland. When I was doing the postdoc with her in particular, we used to have the most freewheeling conversations about fiction, history, politics, animals, and technology. But she would, of course, only publish on things she'd really devoted herself to. And as a millennial academic who has used social media throughout my research career, this was an interesting corrective to my own tendencies. And as I've said, she was endlessly supportive, even when she didn't agree with what you were arguing. What mattered is that you explained the stance you were taking. I experienced her as such a reliable source of intellectual support in my life that there were times when it simply faded into the background and I didn't realize or reflect enough on the role that she was playing. But I feel eternally grateful for this. I feel guilty that I never actually said this to her, but I suspect she knew how thankful I was. It also occurred to me how little awareness there was of the activism she was engaged in. From her initial discovery of sociology via CND to the work on human trafficking with the Pontifical Academy, and the charities she set up and ran in Kenilworth. For someone whose deepest intellectual satisfactions came through often abstract inquiry, she was nonetheless inclined towards acting in the world, often in enormously effective ways. In this sense, I suggest that her intellectual achievements should be seen alongside her institutional ones. From the ISA to Warwick Sociology Department to the Centre for Social Ontology and the Pontifical Academy. Maggie was a genuinely unique person, and even now it's been a few months, I'm still processing the fact that I'll never speak to her again. I'm feeling that particularly at the moment because this stage being at the end of a project that I've been working on for a very long time, grappling with conceptual questions, is it exactly the point at which I would have loved nothing more than to talk to her about what these issues are and why I think they matter. But we're lucky to have been able to have those conversations over the years, and this panel is great to reflect on that fact. I just want to end by saying that I think she was a pretty unique person beyond all else. And the standards that she embodied, the intellectual ones, the political ones, and the civic ones, are standards that I think we should all be trying to live up to.
Thank you, Mark, for sending that recorded video. Fortunately, Mark is online now, so I just wanted to ask a follow-up question, Mark. Uh, what would you consider, just very briefly, perhaps one very fond memory of Margaret, since you've worked so closely with her all these years?
That's a good question, and it occurred to me, I think it might be a week before I handed in my PhD. And I spent the day at her house in Kenilworth. We had a nice lunch. And then we spent the afternoon and evening drinking white wine while talking through the thesis chapter by chapter. And at that stage, I was stressed and desperate to finish it. But not only did that day leave me newly confident about the work that I'd done, it also reconnected me to, why I'd done it, why it interested me. And I think in that sense, it embodies an experience I often had where talking to Maggie would reconnect me with my kind of intellectual and moral sources. And that experience of the preparation for the PhD is one that I thought back to a lot this week because I'd like to have those conversations about the book. She was great to talk to, particularly at that stage of working on something. And so I've been asked to next to introduce Ismail Al-Amoudi, who I first met through Maggie as the director of the Centre for Social Ontology and one of her longest term collaborators.
So Professor Margaret Scotford Archer, also known as Maggie, she insisted that we would call her that. She was a friend, she was a mentor, and she was a colleague to me. I started reading her works during my doctoral years in 2002 to 2006. It's Tony Lawson who introduced me to her at a debate in London between Roy Bhaskar and Alex Kallinikos, maybe around 2003. At that time, I must confess that I was spending slightly less time on her books than on those of Bhaskar and Foucault, on Wittgensteinians and ethnomethodologists, Tony Lawson's books, and a few interesting critical management scholars. But maybe that's because, just like good wine, it takes time to appreciate certain things. Had you asked me at that time, I might have responded that her works were certainly magisterial, but that they were also populated with subjects that were a bit too uniform to my taste. Just like Mark was talking, also about that specific point. And the social processes seemed a little bit too neat to be true, maybe because she loved diagrams. And, diagrams are a bit like Marmite. You love them or you hate them. And so it all felt a bit as if the fundamental quirkiness of human subjectivity was missing, or at least that I had missed it when reading her books. And indeed, Indeed, I hadn't yet read her Structure, Agency, and the Internal Conversation, which was the prequel to Making Our Way Through the World, which Mark is absolutely right to say that it is one of the most humane sociological books that have been written, I believe. But it's in Structure, Agency, and the Internal Conversation where she would precisely produce a reflexive framework that moved us beyond the automatically transmitted subjectivity, think Bourdieu, the automatically transmitted subjectivity that had been so commonly attributed to Homo sociologicus. I can think of few authors whose scholarship is at once so consistent and inventive as to pursue a theoretical path over more than 40 years with such consistency and inventivity. After the morphogenetic approach and being human, which was a robust defense of humanism that is perhaps more needed than ever in 2023. Think of all the talk about posthuman. She wrote, after that, after being human, she wrote an absolutely splendid trilogy on how we mature as social subjects through our internal conversations. And it is around that time that I joined the Center for Social Ontology that she had just founded at École Polytechnique de Lausanne. At that point, I started reading, or better rereading her works in parallel to Mead's Mind, Self, and Society. I completely agree with you, Mark, about the references and the sources of inspiration that you have cited. I can't stress enough also the importance, I believe, of Mead on her thinking. And then it clicked. After that, we had countless discussions, Maggie and I, about social theory while facing the Lac Léman. And the discussion with Maggie about social theory, it can start from any detail. Anything that happens around you can open up a splendid and deep conversation on social theory. I was getting ready to understand and even contribute to the two vast research projects that would follow up, so Morphogenic Society and Posthuman Society. We already had an occasion today. We will have plenty other occasions in the near future to speak of Maggie's vast contributions to realist social theory. For the moment, suffice it to say that following her last wills, I asked an excellent research assistant, Aristide Bertrand, I don't know if he's online, to compile a list of her works for the website of the Center for Social Ontology. So I just asked Aristide, can you write a bibliography? The bibliography is currently about 19 pages long. Bit over 5,000 words, if I last time I counted, and Aristide is still working on it. He deserves a holiday. So it is humbling to think that almost all of these works are single authored, and that many of them consist in very thick books, just as Mark has mentioned. So rather than attempt to summarize or comment Maggie's contributions to social theory, I would like rather to say a few words about her life as an activist. Mark touched on this. I'd like to deepen that point. Social activism, I believe, is key to critical realism. As most of you will already know, she met Roy Bhaskar and other critical realists during marches against the nuclear bomb in London. So it wasn't in a college in Oxford. It was during a march against the nuclear bomb. I was still a toddler back then, so they were marching, I was toddling. Many years later, in the early 2010s, Maggie oversaw an important study on human trafficking for the Vatican. It was her third pope by then. I remember many discussions with her about how she hoped to transform the laws of the European Union so as to grant trafficked persons the right to stay in the country of arrival. From her deep understanding of the mechanisms of human trafficking, she knew that these persons would never be safe again in their home countries. I think that's what sociology can be about. I must say that I do not know exactly how far her ideas went with the European Commission, but I do remember one morning in Cardiff, so that must have been around 2015 or 2014, when my colleague Joe Mahoney came to me in quite a hurried state. And Joe is British. Normally, he doesn't get that hurried. He was, sorry for the stereotype, he was holding in his hands a British tabloid whose cover page could read, "Grandmother, 71, tackles slave traffickers for the Pope." If I remember correctly, Joe and I felt sincere pity for the journalists in case Maggie decided to contact them. I'm saying them, I suspect a man for being so toxic and sexist and ageist, but let's not be sexist ourselves and call them them. The anecdote happened in 2014, yes, a couple of years before the dark farce of Brexit and the decadent clowneries of Boris Johnson. But it prefigured some things. All of us respect Maggie's great intellect, and most of us know how vigorous she could be. But she was also a woman of great generosity. In parallel to her high-level activism for trafficked persons, she would speak with the head of the UN, she would speak with heads of states. And at the same time, in parallel, she also purchased a house in the United Kingdom where she hosted trafficked women until they would learn a craft, acquire basic English, and regularize their administrative situation. As an academic mentor, she taught me all sorts of things, big and small. Again, the list is too long for today. But there is one aspect that I want to evoke, especially for the early career researchers in the audience. There is a Zen proverb that says that the bad students, they enjoy recalling how great their master was. And however, conversely, better students, they remember with fondness how harsh their master was with them. And I must say that I did receive over the years a few emails that started with, Ismail, what you suggest is extraordinary. Meaning, of course, that it was extraordinarily foolish. I even remember that after a faux pas that I would rather forget, she simply wrote, I am going to pretend you never made this suggestion and you will do the same. That was towards the start of our collaboration in Lausanne. So I still didn't have a thick elephant skin. I was still an associate prof. And after reading that line, I felt an urge to bury myself into Switzerland's deepest anti-nuclear shelter. But I'm not a saint either, and I can also have a temper. I even remember one occasion when, to prove my good faith, there was a misunderstanding. I really wanted to prove my good faith. So I submitted a written resignation from the Center for Social Ontology. Between inverted comma, once I would have completed all my remaining duties. Basically, I told her, well, I made a few commitments. I'm going to honor them because there is no way I can break my own word. However, after that, then hopefully this can give you time to find a replacement. And that was perhaps the only time when I ever saw Maggie back off. But as she used to say, quoting an Italian proverb, there is no affection without some tension. And indeed, she was one of the few academic colleagues who attended my wedding towards the end of our adventures in Switzerland. So today, perhaps like others in this room, I feel orphaned. But more importantly, like all those who knew Maggie and her work, I feel a duty to transmit to the next generation of scholars not only the splendid social philosophy that she produced over thousands of densely written pages, but also the formidable spirit of curiosity and integrity that animated her scholarly practice. Rest in peace, Maggie. It was all worth it. Thank you.
Well, my name is Tone Skjenningsrud, and I come from the north of Europe. You might say the outskirt is actually past the polar circle, so it's near the North Pole. But we reach out to intellectual things in the world, and in Tromsø, I was introduced to Margaret Archer's authorship in the late 90s, when a colleague of mine said that, you know, we were working on educational issues in sociology of education. And she told me that, you know, there is a British sociologist, Margaret Archer. She's really the greatest in our field, but she's too difficult for us. We won't be able to understand what she's written. So I thought, well, okay, I'll remember her name, but I won't really try to read what she has written because it will be too difficult for me. It will be beyond my intellectual powers. But then I came across an article written by Margaret Archer, and I thought, well, this is actually understandable. I can understand it. And I was even intrigued by it because it was so forceful. And she was so straightforward and very critical, actually, of other people, other authors, other sociologists. So I was actually inspired by her writings. And then I started reading her, you know, some works which wasn't mentioned by Mark Harrigan. Actually, her 800 pages volume about the social origins of educational systems, which is actually the very big basis of her later morphogenetic approach. So actually, it is a big production that she's left behind, and it is a big job to try to simulate it. But if you make an effort, it's really worth it. Why, like Mark said. So I tried to meet Margaret because I thought actually I can understand her writing, and it should be interesting to talk to her and find out. So I registered for a conference in Örebro in Sweden, where Birth Denmark was the organizer. And that was the second annual conference in IACR, which hadn't been established yet. And I presented a paper, and I had Margaret as the opponent, and she was very polite and constructive because, of course, I hadn't had more than a few months to read Margaret Archer and Roy Buskar and all the necessary background to write anything worthwhile from a critical realist perspective. But so that's how I met her, and that was really a great experience. So I continued to study Margaret's work, and she encouraged me actually in Örebro to write the history of Norwegian education from a morphogenetic perspective, which I finally did. And I think it's, well, it was truly inspirational. And I have always since then been a critical realist. I try to inspire my colleagues and my students to read critical realism, and I also often translate English writings to Norwegian just to make it easier for my students. And maybe I've been too kind to them and made it too easy for them so that they become lazy. But there were two things. Actually, one very important thing about the traditional critical realism, which was very useful and to me in Tromsø, because the anthropologists were very dominant at that time, and they believed in just interpretations. They thought that causality doesn't have any place in the social sciences. You can't talk about causes, you can only interpret cultures. So when I could reclaim causality, that was really, I felt very liberated then, because I stopped talking about causality because that was sort of taboo in our intellectual environment. And yeah. It was very a great experience to be able to invite Maggie to be a visiting professor for 2 years in Tromsø in I think it was 17 to 19. Yes. And we wrote, we had a group of researchers there doing research about education in Norway from a critical realist and morphogenetic point of view, and it was published by Routledge eventually as a collection of articles about the morphogenesis of the Norwegian educational system. So then I had the occasion to collaborate with her on an article about comparing the Norwegian and the Danish educational systems, because the Danish system was one of the countries that she had studied in her social origins of educational systems. And the Norwegian system is different because, well, we were part of Denmark until 1814 as more or less a colony. And after that, we were independent, and we developed a different system, educational system. The Norwegian system is was centralized, and the Danish was decentralized. So that was a sort of interesting question to answer. Why did the two systems differ when they parted in terms of the nation that they belonged to and the state under which they were subordinated. I think that I was fascinated by Margaret's style of writing since the first article I wrote that she had written. And I read her article, her first article. That was her sort of combatant attitude in a way, and her lack of fear in opposing other people's approach in the social science. And I found that very impressive and very refreshing. Now I know that, of course, Norwegians are we are influenced by the fact that we're a small country. We don't dare to be unfriendly with the colleagues because we'll meet the colleague in the next at the next corner or in the next meeting among academic educationalists. So we are a bit careful about being not too confrontational. And the British have a much more are much less conflict shy than we are. So maybe that she's a carrier of the British tradition in that sense. But I thought she was exceptionally clear in opposing other people's theories and very audacious, because it requires courage to do what she has done all along. So I think other people before me now here tonight have been able to describe this trait that she had in being forthright and very stringent in her thoughts and not being submissive. But I would like to mention also another aspect of her, and that is that I've heard sometimes that she has received criticism for not engaging in feminist scholarship. I think people have said that no, she never talks about men and women and the different roles they have and how women are suppressed in our society, and it's a patriarchal society. But if you look at her life, I think that it's a very different impression and a different profile that emerges from her life. In fact, it's a very remarkable life from a feminist perspective, and that's what we often mention to female colleagues when we when we try to sell Maggie's theories and Maggie's approaches. We point out that she has critiqued actually a whole range of contemporary male icons in the social sciences. That is quite remarkable. She's critiqued Anthony Giddens, Michel Foucault, Jürgen Habermas, Zygmunt Bauman, Ulrich Beck, Pierre Bourdieu, Basil Bernstein, all, and probably others which have escaped me, but I have noticed especially these, because they have really been icons in Norwegian intellectual life, and I guess in European intellectual life as well. And she has not hesitated to critique their basic approach and their ontologies in the social ontologies. So I think that is her life sort of is a proof that she was perhaps not a feminist. I don't know. I never asked her, but she was living a scholarly life which showed that she was not submissive to her male colleagues, and she was not intimidated into silence by them. So was she discriminated against because she was a woman in academia? I think so. Although I don't know, probably if we had asked her, I don't know whether she would have answered, but I think probably she could have told us about several episodes, like Ismail told us right now about the report in British newspapers about the 71-year-old grandmother who helped the Pope. What? Yes, yes. It's very derogatory, isn't it? A 70-year-old grandmother, well, not necessarily derogatory by itself, but it could have been mentioned that she was a professor of sociology and had some expertise, you know. So, and also, I know that I have just registered this from distance, obviously, but I noticed that in a British sociology journal, Anthony King wrote about Anthony Giddens and Margaret Archer as the odd couple. I think she mentioned it to me once, and she didn't like. I noticed she didn't like it, and I can understand that very well because Maggie had, as everybody knows, criticized Giddens severely for his conflationary theory, structuration theory, and I think probably the odd couple refers to some English play or novel or something, or some figures which are well known to the public. And the essence of it is that this couple, disagree on everything, but actually they are quite unified at the bottom of it. Essentially, they agree on things. So he was sort of trying to minimize their theoretical differences. He was saying that actually it's just something on the surface here. Basically, they have something in common, which he found out was individualism. It's really incredible to be able to invent stories like that, to sort of neglect meeting her views, her scientific views, and argue about them, and just creating a story about an odd couple. So I think that what Maggie has given to us then is a lot of good ideas, good concepts, and stringent thinking, which has been mentioned before here. And I think particularly one thing which I really appreciate is that she has articulated the causal power of the person. And I remember this because I remember the old article by Dennis Wrong, who wrote about the over-socialized conception of man in sociology. And many others have had over-socialized conceptions. And already in Örebro, Maggie and I and Andrew Sayre toasted to the power of the person. So that was a basic sentiment. I had discovered that even before she wrote her book about reflexivity and being human and all that, which has really elaborated the notion of the power of the person. So thanks, Maggie, for giving us the causal power of the person.
So Tuna made me think of some things that I had forgotten. Well, first of all, what I hadn't forgotten is that there was a time when I met Maggie, when Giddens dominated sociology. Everyone was reading Giddens. Everybody liked Giddens. Giddens' name has faded. I think his sensibility remains pretty strong in the discipline. I was one of the sharpest critics of Giddens in the United States. I knew vaguely that there was this British sociologist who also seemed to be a critic of Giddens. And she was a founder of the Pontifical Academy of the Social Sciences. Wow. She doesn't like Giddens and she's a Catholic. I'd really like to meet her. Well, I didn't plan on meeting her. I was introduced to her, I think around 1998 by Roy Bhaskar. Roy had read a paper I had written, Defending the Self. Oh, let me back up. One thing about Giddens that one thing that Maggie did that I think is important, and it's in contrast to Giddens. Giddens softens social structure, hard social structure, the way a Marxist would think of social structure. He kind of dissolves it. And he also, I hadn't thought of it until Tona mentioned it, he also dissolves the self. The self is like a zombie that just doesn't have intentions. The intentions only surface under special circumstances. Maggie in critical realism, Maggie's direction of it, gives us something remarkable because they're both still kind of absent in sociology today. A strong sense of structure and a strong sense of the self. If you think of the moves of the cultural turn that dissolves structure, the praxis turn, or the pragmatists that want to dissolve the self again into zombies that just go do everything by habit. The critical realism that Maggie did so much to shape affirms at the same time a strong sense of social structure that you're not going to find too much outside of the critical realist circles, and a strong sense of agency that you're not going to find too much out of critical realist circles. So I had written some piece defending the self because I was on a similar trajectory to Maggie, in which I cited the Upanishads, and Roy found it and said, Roy was about to go into his spiritual phase, thought I was brilliant, and dragged me at one of the meetings, one of the early meetings of the IACR. It was the first meeting I ever attended. I think it was the second one. I don't know. You said it was one of the early ones. I think it was the second or third meeting in Essex, England. He says, Maggie, you got to meet Doug. And I was, of course, very excited to meet Maggie. And he also introduced me at the time to Andrew Sayer. He said, and you have to meet Andrew, who's a Christian socialist. We're going to write a book together. We're all going to write a book, which was a book on transcendence. And Johnny's going to ask me for one of my favorite memories. I have a number of favorite memories, but one of them is meeting at Roy's, at that time, estate. And Maggie, towards the end, she didn't smoke as much, but in the early days, she smoked a lot. And I smoked with her, and I still, when I'm on conferences, have a cigarette or two. Don't tell my wife. My friend Maui's going to tell my wife, I know, but one of my images is Maggie being in Roy's house. Roy didn't want her to smoke in the house, and he caught her with the window up, smoking up through and trying to smother her from smoking. That's one of my images of Maggie. So Maggie and I really hit it off right away for a number of reasons. And again, Tuna, I think that, well, we were allies in so many things. And again, listening to Tuna, I think maybe she saw in me a fellow combatant, that somebody who was just a combatant, because what we did was combat. We were very combative in our writings against what we saw as lazy thinking, lazy and pernicious thinking. But when I met Maggie, Maggie was far more prominent than I was. And one of, I think, the traits that I most valued in her is she had no regard for status. What she cared about was ideas. So she had some kind of there was some kind of event commemorating her at the ISA meeting in Brisbane, which is above where Lisa is, some town in Australia, larger town in Australia. She asked me to be the respondent, and she was grateful that I came. And to me, it was like an honor to be asked by Maggie Archer to be the respondent, and she was grateful that I came. And I mean, she could have asked any more prominent people than me. She asked me. she had a in Outback, there's Outback, Germany. There's this they do one of these summer schools, and she asked me again to accompany her. I said, "Oh, yeah, sure," and she was grateful that I showed up. It was one of my. I really had we had a great time there, and one of the things I really enjoyed was Maggie's fluent in French. My French is patchy at best. My Spanish is better, but Maggie's is better than mine. We both are kind of patchy in Italian, but she's much better than Italian than me. My German is patchy, but Maggie had no German. And she had to rely on me when we went out, and I would talk and blah, blah, blah. And I talked to the people, and she was very impressed with me. And I was like, at that time, my German is kind of dormant now, but at that time I was pretty good. So I was quite pleased with that. She asked me to make several appearances at the Pontifical Academy of the Social Sciences at the Vatican, which was a great experience. And again, she could have asked other people. She seemed, Maggie really, and you can see it not just with me, she's always going to talk to anybody. I mean, academic or non-academic. And one of my colleagues here said she's a good listener. She would just listen to people and hear what they had to say. And she's, of course, very rigorous thinker, very conceptual thinker. I was there at the Vatican when Bernie Sanders, accompanied by Jeffrey Sachs, came. She was furious. Now, I kind of liked Bernie Sanders. I voted for him in the primary, so I was kind of excited. But she was furious that somehow they what's the word? Yeah, okay, imposed. That's not the word I was looking for, but crashed. The American slang would be they crashed. They crashed the event, and making it deviating from what its purpose to be. And she was not happy. And she went after the bishop who oversaw this, and that was kind of the beginning of their rift that later developed. I was going to say, I lost my train of thought here. Oh, I know what I want to say. Yeah, Ishmael alluded to it. She not only was she a person of ideas, she was a person of action and integrity. And so when she was asked, and I was involved in that too. I mean, she brought me in on that too. The anti-trafficking report. Well, after that, she made her house a sanctuary for trafficked women. I mean, her house. And it was really oriented towards that. I know there were people in Eastern Europe that she was constantly guiding and helping. And of course, then in Poland, they became very attracted to critical realism. And I'm getting a sign to stop talking. So she loved the Polish group, and I know they miss her, and so do I. I mean, she was not just a major figure, but she was a very loyal and dear friend.
Thank you, Dog. Thank you, Tona, Ishmael, and Mark. I wish we had more time, but we are running out of time. So I'd just like to encourage you, if you'd like to share some memories or some words of gratitude to Maggie for helping you in your work, please use the QR code and post your message there so we can share this with her family, particularly her two sons. In closing, I would like to read excerpts from her last two emails about the conference. She was looking forward to coming here, but she began to complain about her shoulder. And then on April 25th, she sent an email saying, she sent a very short email saying, in brief, more when I get organized, just very regretfully to say that I definitely will not be present for IACR and after. It seems I'm more seriously ill than I thought, and it's not all about the shoulder. And then a couple of days later, she says, I am blessed with very kind friends. You ask for updates, and I'm afraid that here's today's, which is quite a blow to future planning. It seems that after a CT scan last week, my hospital consultant has diagnosed advanced pancreatic cancer and assesses that I have 3 months to live. I'm not afraid, and I regret most that I am letting my friends down. I will not see my last book in print. Thank you for continuing to pray for me. So at this point, I'd just like to invite everyone to raise a glass to Maggie. Let's all rise and raise a glass to Maggie. So to Maggie, I'd like to invite you to look at the camera because we're going to send this to her sons. To Maggie, thank you for allowing us to stand on your shoulder. To this intellectual giant and generous soul, may God bless you. Through the ideas you passed on to us and the memories you created with us, you will continue to live on in our hearts. Rest in power, Maggie. Cheers.